Good afternoon. My name is Tim Mischling, Research Associate at the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Prolonged Recovery of Michigan's Taxable Values. Michigan local governments have collectively faced difficult times over the past 15 years. Starting in 2001, they suffered from reductions in state revenue sharing that resulted from the reprioritization of funds at the state level, shifting funding away from their statutory purpose to instead be used for other state functions. Then, starting in 2008, they suffered from the effects of the housing bubble burst, foreclosure crisis, and the outmigration of people and manufacturing jobs from Michigan's communities. We are now approximately 7 years removed from what seems to have been the worst of the recession. Jobs are coming back. Property values are picking up, at least in some parts of the state. The state budget remains balanced, which may signal more consistent state funding in the future. But because of limitations placed on the growth of taxable values, the property tax, which is the primary source of revenue for most of Michigan's local governments, is not seeing a similar recovery. Today's webinar will bring you the highlights of a report we released last week that examines the local governments, counties, and regions that are not yet seeing a recovery in their taxable values, and then explores the issues caused by this slow growth. The Citizens Research Council of Michigan is a statewide nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is the Research Council's 100th year of operation, a longevity we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private, not-for-profit entity, and we rely on charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, and corporations. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. You can learn more about the Research Council at www.crcmich.org. At the right of our website, you'll find an opportunity to sign up for our email distribution list to be notified about newly released papers. Our presenter today is Eric Lupher, the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. Eric has 29 years of experience with the Research Council. Most of that time has been spent working with local governments. He has worked on city charter issues, state revenue sharing, property taxes, intergovernmental collaboration, consolidation of local governments, and many other aspects of local government. Please note, we are recording this webinar and will post it up to our webpage where it will be available for future viewing. Additionally, we have everyone but the presenters on mute, so we will not be able to hear you if you speak. To ask a question, please type your query into the questions panel that should appear on your screen. You may type these questions in at any time. If you have additional technical problems during the webinar, please let us know by calling 734-542-8001. After the webinar, you will receive an email soliciting your feedback. We would very much appreciate any comments or suggestions that you may have. With that, I'll turn things over to Eric.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you all for coming here today. Over the last year, the Citizens Research Council has compiled data on the taxable values of every Michigan, city, and township over the past 17 years for a report that was published a week ago, yesterday. The point of the exercise was to quantify the economic condition of a specific sector of the Michigan economy, local government. I also want to recognize that taxable value serves as a tax base for the state-levied property tax for schools, for property taxes levied by school districts as part of the school funding system, and for the financing of bonds issued by both school districts and local governments. We undertook this project to quantify circumstances we were observing in a few individual local governments. While the economy is certainly in recovery, even if slow economic recovery, the recovery is not reaching all local governments. I don't want to go into great detail on the economic recovery Michigan has been experiencing since the end of the Great Recession and accordingly the end of Michigan's single state recession. Saying that, it seems I better define a few terms as we get going. The nation experienced a recession that was triggered by this uncertainty of the events around 9/11, so beginning in the end of 2001. The recession was relatively short and not very deep. While the rest of the nation grew out of the recession, for Michigan this was the beginning of a nearly decade-long recession that saw nearly 800,000 lost manufacturing jobs, outmigration of people resulting in the only state to experience negative growth between the 2000 and 2010 census. I will refer to this condition today as Michigan's single state recession. The next nationwide recession occurred from late 2007 into 2009, triggered by the housing bubble burst and the securities based on the value of those mortgages. This recession was relatively deep and long in duration. This period is generally referred to as the Great Recession. What you see before you is a quarter-to-quarter growth in the gross domestic product for Michigan from 2005 to the most recent reporting period in 2016. The Great Recession is clearly seen, and it is clear that Michigan's gross domestic product has been growing since. Robert Dye at Comerica Bank has created a Michigan Economic Activity Index. With all growth indexed against 2008, the index measures change in economic conditions over time. You can see here that following decline that ended in 2009, economic activity has been growing since. Much has been made of the fact that the growth of the national per capita personal income has been outpacing growth of Michigan's per capita personal income for several years. You can see in this chart that our loss relative to the national average bottomed out in 2009, and the general slope of the line since then has been generally positive. Michigan's per capita personal income has been gaining back some of what was lost relative to national average, even if that recovery has not been at the same pace that it was lost. Here you see what happened to employment growth. You see 10 years of negative growth, with the greatest loss in 2008 and 2009 resulting from the Great Recession. Michigan employment has been growing since 2010, but we have a long way to go to recover all the jobs that were lost during Michigan's single state recession. What you do not see in that last chart is the growth of employment by sector since 2010. Here you see that every sector has grown except one. Led by growth in manufacturing and construction jobs, overall growth has been broadly shared, but government employment has declined 7% since 2010. In fact, local government is down 20% relative to 2001. The loss of private sector employment was widely covered. You can see here how it trended down, that's the gray line on this chart, how it trended down during Michigan's single state recession and fell sharply during the Great Recession. It has been in growth mode in the years since then. Conversely, local government employment, the darker line, has experienced moderate growth in 2002 and 2003, but has been declining ever since. We've seen signs of it bottoming out in the last couple of years, but it is too early to tell if the tide has been reversed. Some may say that's a positive. Less government employment is a sign of less government. Government is funded through taxation, which means it is using less of the result of economic activity in other sectors to fund its activities. But before dismissing the job loss as an overall positive, we must recognize that government employment makes up about 13.5% of overall employment just a few years ago, with local government employment making up 9% of that total. Beyond controlling the cost of government, the loss of jobs in this magnitude may be a drag on overall economic activity. Former government employees have lost purchasing power, and this is just the most easy aspect of government sector to measure. Overall government spending is down, which means fewer vehicles are being purchased for use by the local governments, less office supplies are being purchased, and across the board, there's less stimulus to the economy from local government. Our report is about the prolonged recovery of taxable value, which is the base for the property tax, but it must be recognized that this prolonged recovery has not happened in a vacuum. Before local governments began seeing loss in tax base, they were seeing declines and funding distributed by the state as state revenue sharing. Michigan sends revenues to local government in two programs grouped into state revenue sharing. What you see here as the blue segments of the bar chart is constitutional revenue sharing. The Constitution requires the state to share a percent of sales tax revenues with local governments and distribute the revenues based on population. The gray segment represents statutory revenue sharing. Since the 1930s, the state has shared revenue additional to the constitutional share, and since the 1970s, the distribution methods attempted to recognize that the demand on local governments are not equal. Urban communities with higher levels of density generally have higher demands for services and relatively less tax base to fund the desired services. The state has rarely provided full funding for statutory state revenue sharing, but it was nearly fully funded until Michigan's single state recession, when massive amounts of funds statutorily dedicated to local governments were diverted for other purposes. The black segment of the bar charts represents the funding diverted for other state purposes. This has amounted to about $7 billion if you add up all that black share over the period of Michigan's single state recession carrying forward through 2016. While I do not have the loss mapped by local government, it is significant to know that those receiving the most, those that were receiving the most are those that have lost the most. Small governments and townships lost very little statutory revenue sharing and generally are enjoying annual growth in constitutional state revenue sharing. But the bigger governments, those serving most metropolitan areas, were receiving more and have lost more. These are generally the same local governments that have lost the largest amounts of taxable value, as I'll describe as follows. But the plight of local governments cannot solely be attributed to state policy. What you see here is a year-to-year percent change in statewide inflation-adjusted property tax base from 1928 to 2016. You can see on the left side of the chart the effects of the Great Depression in the 1930s. The loss of tax base was deeper than what happened in the Great Recession, but the losses were not as long in duration. You see a few years when negative growth was experienced, but it was not until the Great Recession where anything comparable to the Great Depression was experienced. Lost tax base in the Great Recession began in 2008 and generally lasted until about 2014. So with that in mind, we set out on our report. The goal was to look at the recent declines in taxable values to see who was affected and what can be done about it. To perform this study, we created a database with the taxable values of every city and township, county, and region of the state. The first step, as I've already alluded to, was adjust for inflation. Even with low levels of inflation, changes in purchasing power happen over time, and we wanted to account for that. And then we chose two different periods of time for comparison. The first period was that just prior to the Great Recession, but this didn't occur all at the same time. Most local governments, their taxable values peaked in 2007, and another large number of the local governments peaked in 2009, but others have peaked at other times. Rather than creating an artificial time, we simply refer to this as peak value. But you say, we all know that the artificially inflated property values were a leading cause of the Great Recession, so isn't measuring against the period just before then measuring against a flawed benchmark? To account for this, we went back to the period before Michigan's single state recession. So I will also refer, as we go forward, to comparisons to the year 2000. Let's look a little closer at our recent history. First, you need to know something about terminology. All properties that are not tax exempt are valued at 50% of their true cash value. The values are reported by the cities and townships, are equalized at the county level to ensure non-preferential treatment within municipalities, and those values are equalized at the state level. This is referred to as state equalized value. Here we see the growth of statewide nominal state equalized value, the red line, and inflation-adjusted state equalized value, the blue line, in billions of dollars from 2000 to 2016. Inflation-adjusted statewide state equalized value grew by 32% from 2000 to its peak in 2007, then declined by about 31% to its nadir in 2013. Statewide state equalized value has not recovered to its 2007 peak value, but it has increased by 10.6% since its lowest point. Before showing you about taxable value, I want to talk a little bit about the Headlee Amendment and our tax on our taxable value cap that affects how we get to a second measure. Everyone, if you've been in Michigan for a little while, you've heard about the Headlee Amendment. It's commonly referred to that because Dick Headlee was the author of the amendment, and it of course required approval of the electors to amend the Constitution, but a series of amendments all enacted in 1978 are given that common term that this is the person who designed it, and therefore that's the name that we refer back to. It was designed to create balance by tying growth in government revenues, local government revenues, to the rate of inflation. Basically, it says that if the tax base grows faster than the rate of inflation, then the tax rate has to be reduced by an amount sufficient so that the net result for a unit of government is an inflationary growth in the tax revenues. I sometimes use a hot air balloon to illustrate how this works. Hot air balloons carry a basket with people up into the air because the air inside the balloon is hotter than the air outside of it, and heat rises. The trick in navigating a hot air balloon is to keep it at just the right altitude. If you go too high, the air gets cold and the passengers are uncomfortable. If you go too low, you risk hitting trees, power lines, or other things. The Headlee Amendment was designed to keep taxes, i.e. the hot air balloon, at a steady altitude. If the tax base grows or if the air outside the balloon gets colder, the revenues generated will increase, the tax rate will decrease, and all right, let me back up. If the tax base grows, the revenue will generate will increase and the balloon will rise. In a hot air balloon, you would compensate by letting some air out of the balloon. In government, you compensate by decreasing the tax rate. The problem, as I'll describe later, is that local governments have lost the ability to keep the balloon from falling. When it was enacted, the Headlee Amendment allowed for tax rate roll-ups that would pump some hot air into the balloon to keep it at the accepted altitude. Now you can only do this with taxpayer approval. There are no automatic mechanisms to keep the balloon aloft. The problem with the Headlee Amendment was that it attempted to create tax limitation at the jurisdiction level. The jurisdiction-wide growth in tax base was an average of growth rates for each parcel. That meant that some properties could increase a lot as long as there were some that did not increase by much or decreased. Even though a government's tax revenue growth was under control, taxpayers were not satisfied because some were still feeling the pinch of high tax burdens caused by this arrangement. In response to the failings of the Headlee Amendment, another tier of tax limitations were imposed in 1994. This affects values at the parcel level. This tax limitation says that the taxable value of any property cannot increase from one year to the next by more than the rate of inflation, or 5%, if inflation goes above 5%. I've tracked the permissible increases with this chart at the bottom of the slide. In 21 years of history under this program, inflation has never exceeded the 5% cap, and it will not for 2017 values. If the property is sold or otherwise transfer a new owner, the value pops up to the state equalized value, and additions and modifications are outside of the limit. This is the limitation that is greatly affecting the ability of local governments to recover from the lost values experienced during the Great Recession. So in contrast to the SEV chart we looked at earlier, we see here that taxable value did not grow as fast before the Great Recession and has not grown as much in recovery. Statewide state equalized value grew by 32% from 2000 to its peak in 2007. Taxable value grew by only 23.5%. State equalized value then declined by 31% to its nadir in 2013. Taxable value reached its lowest point in 2014, almost 22% less than the 2007 value. Since reaching their lowest values, state equalized value has increased by 10.6%, but taxable value has only grown by 1.6% on a statewide level. Before moving on, you need to understand how the interaction of Headlee Amendment and Proposal A work. And this needs to get to a broad audience. I know a lot of those people tuning in today from local government or from associations associated with local government, work around local government. So a lot of you understand this already, but it's going to require citizens and our legislators to understand this interaction of these two limitations and how they're putting a squeeze on local governments. Rather than replacing the Headlee Amendment limitations with the taxable value limitation, they were layered on top of each other. Both are tied to inflation, so you say, well, if both are tied to inflation, they must be serving the same end. But the way they were implemented creates a compounding effect. If properties are sold, the values pop up to the state equalized value. This causes the overall growth for a jurisdiction to grow faster than the rate of inflation and triggers a tax rate rollback. That rate is applied to taxes on all properties, even those affected by the inflationary cap, and the local governments end up with less taxable tax revenues than the inflationary increase. So while you might say that a local government that has people interested in it, investing in those properties, is a healthy local government, in fact, local governments are being penalized by the system in place. So let's go back to examining changes to statewide tax base. The state classifies different properties according to their use. We've included the major ones here, but there are others. Starting with the agricultural property, which is this line here, it doesn't seem to differentiate the way this software is interpreted. It's hard to differentiate it, but the sort of flat one here makes up about 3.2% of the total statewide tax base. You can see that the growth has been pretty steady through 2006. There was a slight dip followed by some growth since then. But you would, for the most part, say that agricultural property of the state was fairly immune to the Great Recession. Residential property is the red line that peaks at the highest amount up here. Residential property makes up 69.3% of the total statewide tax base. It declined by about 20.5% from its peak up here in 2007 to 2012, and then has recovered some value so that the 2016 taxable value was 17.3% lower than the 2007 value, but still 12.7% above what it was in the year 2000. Commercial value is this line that isn't far off from the residential property. It should appear black on your screens. Commercial property makes up about 14.3% of the total. It grew by about 32% from 2000 to 2009, then lost most of its value, so that it ended up about 9.1% of its 2000 value in the end. But the most significant line to me on this chart is the one that sort of comes up to about 14% above let's back up. 14% above its 2000 value, 15%, and then lost 37.2% of its value, so that by 2016, it was about 28% of the value in the year 2000. And I state this in the report, and I'll say it here, if you want to know which local governments are hurting the most from the loss of taxable value, it is those that have been the home to industrial property. So let's first look at taxable value, 2016 taxable value compared to its peak values. In analyzing the data, we found that 85% of the 1,515 cities and townships in the state have less tax base in 2016 than they did at their peaks when adjusting for inflation. 95% of the state population resides in one of these local governments. As you will see shortly, these local governments are located throughout the state. We found that the 2016 taxable values of these 1,295 cities and townships is 22% less than their inflation-adjusted peak values. Residential taxable value for these governments as a whole is down 12%, commercial is down 10%, and industrial taxable value is down 42%. I've put up here the 15 cities that are the furthest below their peak values. Some of these are the usual suspects that you would say, governments that we know have been struggling over the years, Flint, Ecorse, Pontiac, all have had some history with emergency managers. But there are other governments on here that we don't necessarily associate as sort of the usual suspects. These are governments that have done okay over the years, but again, because of the loss of industrial property, they're really behind on their ability to provide services from their property tax revenues. These are the 15 townships for whom taxable values are the furthest below. The contrast between those two tables, you see there's some townships that they're really far below, but it gets healthy pretty quick. There's a number that are below, but when you get into this whole list of townships, many of them are not far from recovering to their peak values. We've mapped out who these communities are on a county-by-county basis. And what you see here are the counties in which every city and township in the county has less tax base in 2016 than they did at their peaks when accounting for inflation. These counties include Alcona, Antrim, Sheboygan, Eaton, Genesee, Gladwin, Kalkaska, Lapeer, Livingston, Macomb, Monroe, Montmorency, Oscoda, St. Clair, Shiawassee, Tuscola, and Wayne. There are another 17 counties. They should be orange on your screen. These counties do not have every city and township below their peak values, but they have only one township that has arisen above its inflation-adjusted peak taxable values. These 17 counties include Alpena, Aranac, Charlevoix, Clare, Crawford, Hillsdale, Ionia, Iosco, Jackson, Luce, Muskegon, Oakland, Otsego, Presque, Roscommon, Van Buren, and Wexford. And then we layer on one more set of counties. These appear in purple. These are 24 counties where there are more than one city or township that is above its peak values, but the vast majority of the cities and townships are below their peak values. And so what I've done is I've created a cliff here. So what I'm showing is any county in which 80% or more of the cities and townships are below their peak taxable value. So to sort of show the quantity of loss among those counties, we've created sort of a heat map. You can see here that the Southeast Michigan counties are the furthest behind their peak values. Genesee and Wayne counties are 32% beneath their inflation-adjusted peak values, followed by Macomb, Oakland, Midland, and St. Clair counties. Another 38 counties are between 10 and 13% 10 and 19% below their peak values. The cities and townships and counties that are above their peak values fall into a couple of categories. Some, like the cities of Saugatuck or Traverse City, have benefited from an interest in owning properties within their jurisdictions because of the nature of those properties, the attractiveness as a tourist community, as a summer homes. These communities have more or less remained recession-proof. There's another set of townships that have very few people and very little development. They did not experience a loss of property value. On the other hand, the local governments that serve those areas are not called upon to provide very many services. So they have not been hit hard, but they have not done much in terms of service delivery to begin with. Finally, we look at these changes in property values by region. The state recently realigned its regions according to economic activity, travel patterns, and other evidence of regional inclination. These prosperity regions, as the state terms them, are shown on the right. The donut chart on the left shows the relative amount of taxable value in each region. Region 10, which makes up Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties, have as much value as regions 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, and 9 combined. Region 4 is which includes the major communities of Kent County, Ottawa County, and so on, include the major metropolitan areas of Grand Rapids, Hollins, Muskegon, and it has the other major concentration of taxable value in the state. So it's important to realize when we look at those past charts and where the loss in those past maps, when we look at where taxable value was lost and where the heat map, which communities have lost the most, we're talking about those communities that were the economic engines of the state as we headed into the Great Recession. These are the communities that were host to industrial manufacturing and where a lot of economic activity was taking place, the sort of economic activity that fuels the sales tax revenues that the state collects, the income tax revenues, and so on, the other state taxes that fund state services. When we look at this on a regional basis, you see everywhere in the state is down compared to its peak values. They're all in red using our sort of heat map. But when you look at those numbers on the map, we see that the east side of the state experienced more loss of values than those on the west side. Each region on the east side of the state is at least 14% below its peak taxable value, more than 20% below for regions 6 and 10, 6 being the thumb and 10 again being Wayne, Oakland, Macomb. Among the regions on the west side of the state, region 4 is down about 11%, which is about the furthest below its peak taxable value, followed by regions 2, which is the Traverse City northwest corner of the state, northwest corner of the mitten, about 10% below, and region 8, which is the bottom left corner of the mitten, which would be Cass County and some of those communities down there. That's about 9.6% below. So again, we have a number of communities, a great majority of our communities serving 95% of our population that doesn't have the tax base it did prior to the Great Recession. But again, maybe those taxable values were a little artificially inflated. We knew on a nationwide basis, and certainly in Michigan, that that was a phenomenon. So let's look at those taxable values compared to their 2000 values. Again, 2000 being just before Michigan's single state recession. What we found was surprising to us. We found that 16% of the cities and townships of the state have less taxable value than they did in 2016 than they did in the year 2000 when adjusting for inflation. More than 2/3 of these are cities, but that still leaves about 1/3 of them that are townships. They are located in every region of the state and 64 of the 83 counties. The status is significant because almost half of the population resides in one of these cities and townships. These local governments are 22% below their inflation-adjusted 2000 taxable values. This includes 20% below their for residential property, 8% below for commercial property, and 51% below for industrial property. Again, I've put out the 15 cities that have lost the most. There's a lot of comparability between this table of the biggest, those furthest behind, and those I showed for the compared to peak values. There's a few different players on here. Again, I would make the point that this is not solely a list of the usual suspects, those communities that we know have been struggling to get through. We see here Dearborn and Centerline and some other communities that we wouldn't necessarily associate as communities that are struggling. Here are the 15 townships that have lost the most taxable value. Again, I make the point that it rises rather rapidly, more rapidly than we see for the cities, going from Royal Oak Township in Oakland County that is pretty significantly below its 2000 taxable value, up to Waterford, again in Oakland County, which is 78% of its 2000 value. And so this is just the sort of tip of the iceberg, given as many townships as we have. But they're affected, and that plays a significant impact here. There are 40 communities, 31 cities, and 9 townships that have are more than 30% below their peak taxable values. You can see that most of these are cities, but there are a few townships on here: Buena Vista, Indians Field, Redford Township. These are mostly, most of the cities are home to about 16.5% of the state population. In most of these cities, 31 of the 40 are in Region 6, which again is the thumb area, Region 9, which is the bottom right corner of the mitten, so Monroe and Adrian, communities like that, and Region 10, which again is Wayne, Oakland, Macomb. Half of the communities are in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties that you see on this, this chart. When we look at the 25 most populous local governments, we see that they are all below their peak values, and most of them are below their 2000 values. We see only a few communities here that have done better than their 2000 values, but all are below peak. Again, we created a sort of heat map to see how counties are doing. Again, counties being the compilation of the cities and townships within them. In 2000, or compared to 2000, there are 9 counties that are below there. You can see Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, St. Clair, Monroe, Genesee, Saginaw, Midland, and Bay counties make up this list. These 9 counties accounted for 54% of the statewide total taxable value, including 53% of the residential taxable value, 56% of the commercial taxable value, and 63% of all industrial taxable value in the year 2000. So I'm putting this out here to make the point that they were major players in our economic activity. From 2000 to 2016, these counties collectively lost 17% of their total taxable value, including 10% of their residential value, 7% of their commercial value, and 41% of their industrial value. As a result, their share of statewide taxable value attributed to these 9 counties has declined. They now, in 2016, account for only 45% of the statewide total, compared to 54% before. Industrial property went from 53 to 45%. Commercial property went from 56 to 51, and industrial property went from 63% of the statewide total in the year 2000 to 55% in the year 2016. Again, looking at the regions, we see what this has meant. Region 10 as a whole is 13% below its 2000 value, and the thumb is still below only about 2%. The west side of the state, the northern, the UP, clearly doing much better. Even when we do that same sort of comparison of east versus west, we see that the west side is doing much better. So when you, depending on where you are, depending on what sort of communities you're dealing with, you're likely to hear two stories of how well Michigan local governments are doing. If you're asking the communities in the Upper Peninsula, you're likely to hear that they're getting by, things are not so bad. If you're in the northern part of the mitten, they're not back to where they were at peak value, but things are trending up and things are doing okay. But again, if you're looking at the lower part of the mitten, most of these communities are the furthest behind their peak values. And when you look at the east side of the state, the thumb area, the metropolitan Detroit, these communities are the furthest behind when they compare them to even their 2000 inflation-adjusted taxable values. Why does this matter? Again, there are some that would say, well, less taxes equals less government, and less government's a good thing. We point this out because we are now 7 years or so removed from the Great Recession. We would have expected local governments over those 7 years to be rebuilding their reserves to be able to weather the next storm. And that's just not happening. They don't have the money coming in from state revenue sharing. They're not getting the money in from property taxes to do the things that they hope to do, let alone to stash any away to be able to weather the next storm. I'm reminded when I'm asked why it matters of a story in Citizens Research Council lore. The researchers had done a project to try to explain why the state was going to increase taxes, and they were doing a speaking tour going throughout the state. And at one point, after they had gone through and explained the need for new taxes, a person in the audience raised their hand and said, I understand everything you just said, but why do we have to pay more taxes? Why can't government just pay for it? And that's kind of the crux of it, that this is the services that you consume most readily as a resident are provided by local governments. And so if you want a quality of life, if you want to have the police or fire department show up when you dial 911, if you want to be able to use the libraries or the parks, if you want to keep your roads from crumbling and the infrastructure you rely on, it requires taxes to pay for it. And those local governments that are not recovering their taxable value are going to suffer the most in the quality of life they can provide to the residents. I also point this out because it matters for economic development. Businesses that the state, that our local economic development people are trying to attract from other places, whether it's international economic development or trying to attract businesses from other states, they want to know that their facilities will be served by the public safety. They want to know that they're going to be able to get their supplies in so they can manufacture. They want to know that they can get their goods to market so they can be sold. They want to know that their workers will be safe at work, traveling to work, and when they're at home, and that their residents will enjoy services to make up a quality of life. So I think it's a logical conclusion that economic development will suffer if these communities are not served, if there's not the wherewithal to provide the services that people expect of them. So what to do about it? Before going over some alternatives and sort of what's needed, I want to just sort of lay out, playing amateur political analyst, I don't think it's likely that we're going to see an end to the use of taxable value, an end to the cap on our tax base, the growth of our tax base from year to year. The people were pretty upset. There were a lot of people being affected by the growth in their property tax burden from year to year, and I think that people are going to be very reluctant to give that up. So what can be done? Well, one path is organic growth, to have the new development, to have turnover in property occur at such a pace that the tax base will grow back. For most of our local governments, again, the Upper Peninsula, the top of the Mitten, a lot of areas, it's foreseeable that this is going to happen. They're not so far below their peak values. There will be some turnover in property, and we're going to get there. So over time, there's going to be new growth. There's going to be new residential development. We're going to recover some of the manufacturing that was lost over time. But local governments may or may not benefit from that. The income, the sales, the motor fuel taxes that the state benefits from with a lot of activity don't directly flow to local governments unless state revenue sharing is returned for the sales tax aspect of it. And there are some problems with this sort of strategy of allowing organic growth to get these governments back to where they were. One, some of them are so far behind that it's going to require a prolonged period of time to get back to even where they were, let alone to grow beyond that. We're talking 15, 20, even longer for a lot of years for a lot of those communities. Other problems, local governments have a finite amount of developable land. So if you're in the sort of the exurbs, the outer reaches of our urban areas, if you're in rural areas, even if you're in some of our abandoned cities, cities that have been hollowed out from people moving out through urban sprawl, there might be opportunities for new growth. But in our better cities, in our suburban areas, there isn't a lot of land left where we're going to have new growth. And the growth strategies that the state has put in place, the sort of economic development tools for attracting growth, require local governments to give up part of the new tax base for some period of time. If these communities are offering tax abatements, they're giving up half of the new taxable value for some period, as long as a dozen years. If those communities are using tax increment financing, the new growth is being captured by the DDAs or the TIFs, the different special authorities that exist to help with economic development. So these communities might bring in new development, but it's not helping to provide the police and fire and general services that serve the whole community. What can be done about it then? Here's some alternatives. One, we might think about the taxing authority afforded to our local governments. Every type of local government has a limit on the tax rate. Our local governments are not afforded the ability to just set whatever tax rate they want and offset losses of this magnitude by increasing tax rates. So for cities, it's about 20 mills, for charter townships 10 mills, for different types of governments, different limits. And generally, if you're in a general law township, which in a general law county, then you're dealing with a 15 or an 18 mil cumulative limit that they have to live within. Those limits were developed as a percent of the value of the property. The property was to be assessed at 50% of true cash value, and the mills, a mill being a dollar of tax for every $1,000 of property value. So there was this relationship between how much of the taxable value of a jurisdiction could go to taxes. I would argue since we've moved away from the sort of relationship to the value of the property to this new value of taxable value, creating an artificial assessment of value, we've lost some of that relationship. And so maybe giving some greater taxing authority might help to offset that. It would grow a little bit. I don't know that we would afford enough taxing authority for some of our jurisdictions. And certainly we must recognize that higher tax rates create a disincentive for economic development, and there might be some inclined to find other places to be if the tax burden gets too high. We could think about ending the tax rate rollbacks that are part of the Headlee limitations. Again, as I started off, we have the Headlee tax limitations, the taxable value cap. They're more or less duplicative, both trigger to inflation. But when you have new growth coming in, when you have turnover in property, people investing in your community, that triggers the Headlee tax rate rollbacks, and the local government ends up with less money as a result through property tax revenues. So the idea, if you just ended the tax rate rollbacks, we would still have the cap on growth of taxable value from year to year. Properties would not grow faster than the rate of inflation. We already have that in the state with the state education tax. It's 6% now. It was 6% in 1994 when 6 mills when it was put in place. And so would people notice if their tax rate stayed the same? Would this be objectionable? I don't know. It's worth investigating. We could authorize tax rate rollbacks if we're not going to do away with the tax rate rollbacks. Could we give local governments again the authority to reinflate the balloon if the tax base shrinks, as we have experienced through this last decade, to get back to where they would have been? This doesn't give them new taxing authority. It only says the voters at one time authorized a millage of X amount. They have lost some of that over time. Let's let the local government put it back to X amount, no more. We could think about evening out the taxable value movement from year to year. Taxable value changes as state equalized value did on a year-to-year basis. What we see is that taxable values were allowed to decline on a very rapid level, and now we're seeing them go up slowly over time. If there was a rolling average of the values, if you used a 5-year average of the values, that would lessen the rate of growth, but it would also keep the declines from having full impact on a year-to-year basis, and local governments in the future might not have the same sharp decline in taxable values as they went through the Great Recession. Given some of the problems of our local governments, we might need to think about the service delivery model. What you see when you look at the data in our report is that the counties have not suffered the same magnitude of reductions in taxable values as the cities and townships within them. Sort of the explanation for this is that for each community within the county that lost some taxable values, there's another that has gained or has not lost as much. So it equals out on a wider geographic area. So you would have to say, given this knowledge, that our counties are, at the end of this exercise, better situated to provide services going forward. They have greater ability to fund services on an ongoing basis than the local governments within them. The issue is that Michigan has empowered most of the service delivery at the city and township level. Michigan is one of very few states that have townships, and we have done the property assessing, the tax collection, the conduct of elections. all at the most local level, and there's other services, public safety and other things that are all done at the most local level. And so I think it's in line to look at how we're providing services and look if we could achieve some economies of scale, some economies of skill by thinking about delivering services in another way. We're going to need to think about diversifying our local government revenue sources. When you look at other states, very few states are as reliant on property taxes, solely put all of their eggs into a single basket of providing local government revenues from a single source. When you look at other states, they levy local option sales taxes, income taxes, motor fuel taxes, motor vehicle registration taxes, alcohol taxes, tobacco taxes, public utility excise taxes. I'm not going to spend my time today going through those. I've put a link here at the bottom for a webinar we did a few months ago that went through the different types of taxes, illustrated what states authorize them, and talked about some of the issues that arise when you think about the desire to authorize local option alternative taxes in Michigan, who would levy them, how would you do it, that type of thing. There's a lot of issues. It wouldn't be as simple as simply granting the authority to local governments. There's a lot of things to work out. And I would end by saying that we have to think about state revenue sharing. We need our state legislators to recognize that that was an important part of the funding structure for local governments, and think about putting money back into funding that. Our state revenue sharing system was created to serve two goals. One was to diversify the tax base of local governments. So I just listed off a number of local option taxes that could be authorized. At one point, our state revenue sharing was sharing revenues from the sales tax, the income tax, the intangible fuels tax, from our state business taxes. So by the state sharing those, it was in essence diversifying the tax base of our local governments. The tax-based sharing mechanism was also created to equalize the fiscal capacity of local governments, recognizing that some local governments do not have the relative tax base of other local governments. So by the state playing a role with state revenue sharing, it was able to bring up the least among the local governments so it could at least provide a basic level of local government services. Because we have cut revenue sharing at the same time that local governments have lost so much of their property tax base, we are neither providing the diversity of tax base that local governments need, nor are we helping the least of the local governments amongst us. This is something that the state could do. The state's not sitting on a bucket of money that it could just say, oh, I didn't realize you had the need here. It would probably require some sort of a tax increase or some major change in government prioritization of functions for more money to come that way. But first they have to recognize that there's a real need. So let me end there. Before we go to question and answer, I just want to say on behalf of the staff and directors that we wish you in 2017 a very fact-filled year. This being the year of post-truth. Citizens Research Council is all about the facts, and we hope that you continue to support us with our efforts going forward. So I look forward to any questions you might have, and hope I can address any uncertainty I left with my comments.
Great. Thank you, Eric, for the presentation. We're getting a few questions in. There's still time to type more if anyone has some. One of our participants expressed a bit of concern over the lack of organic growth in municipal revenue not being possible with the restrictive tax limitations that were brought up in the presentation. So I know we addressed some of that at the end, but do you want to talk about that a little more?
Yeah, I would say for most of our local governments, organic growth is going to get them back on a growth path, and they're going to do okay going forward. But in saying that, you have to recognize that of our 1,800 local governments in total, 1,200 of them are townships, and many of those townships are serving the northern reaches of the lower peninsula, a lot of the parts of the upper peninsula where there are there's not a lot of economic activity, there's not a lot of people being served by the government services. But where we have our population, our concentration of population, where we have concentration of business, these communities have fallen significantly behind their peak values, significantly behind where they were in 2000 in real terms, and it is going to take a prolonged period of time for them to grow back to where they were organically. We're talking about 2030, 2035, as long as 2040 for some of these communities, assuming that that there is interest in investing in these communities. And if economic and development is negatively affected by the lack of services, then we wonder, how long will it take? Certainly that's out there, and it's going to happen for a number of our communities. I'm not sure it's going to happen for enough of them, and I'm not sure it's going to happen for the communities that that serve so many of our citizens. Is your mic live?
Retirement, health, and education are the largest expenses at all levels of government. They'll continue to be and actually grow a larger percent of expenses. How can organic growth keep up or raising taxes with those types of expenses?
I think that's a really good point, that at the same time that our tax base is triggered or is marked to inflation, we have a number of services that are growing faster than the rate of inflation. We know that healthcare inflation is faster than the CPI. We know that that our unfunded pensions are going to require more funding. There's a number of services, a number of issues that are going to drive up costs for government as they drive up costs for business, and this is going to have long-term consequences. That again begs for a diversity in the types of revenues that local governments get. If it were income taxes or sales taxes, those tend to grow on a more robust rate than the property tax revenues, and there might be some ability to keep up with the rate of growth of healthcare costs or other issues like that.
Two days ago, the Census Bureau released its estimates of state population. Michigan continues to be a very slowly growing state. Population growth is ordinarily a strong stimulus for the economic growth. Can something be done about the state's very slow growth? Will that continue to limit the tax base growth?
So I think this is sort of a chicken and the egg issue, that the population has not grown, and when you look over the last several decades, it has really not grown in much significant way for several decades now. That's reflected in our congressional delegation, that we keep losing representatives in Washington, D.C. Because the rest of the nation is growing much faster than us. So we are losing people, If you're going to engage in business here, you want to make sure you have enough qualified workers and enough workers in general. We know that the west side of the state is already more or less at full employment. They can't always find the workers they need. So on the one hand, that would say, well, there's then the opportunity to offer higher wages and attract people from other states that have the skills and can provide the services. But then they have to look at the communities they'll be living in, the services they'll be receiving, and ask whether that is acceptable given where they're coming from, where the services have not suffered the same sort of hit as our local government communities. Is there anything our local governments can do? Is there anything our state can do? I think it is providing the best opportunity, the sort of economic gardening, people call it, to provide fertile ground where businesses and people want to be. And that has to happen in cooperation between the state and local governments. It's not solely on the state and it's not solely on the local governments, but it requires them working together.
One participant is curious if we considered showing local community fiscal health in 2016 if revenue sharing had not been reduced. And additionally, if one can recognize that there's been a very few millage rollbacks since Proposal A.
So our report is already pretty long. We didn't really want to get into the sort of fiscal health and how the two go hand in hand. We wanted to recognize that the loss of property tax values did not happen in a vacuum, and that the revenue sharing cut was out there at the same time. It's certainly out there, and that could be an exercise for future study to look at which communities have lost the most revenue sharing and the most property tax base to see where they're at. It's just not something we took on at this time.
Current law permits a Headlee override. Why don't local governing bodies exercise the override if they need the revenue from the override?
So that's a good question, and I've asked local officials about this. I've asked representatives in some of the local government associations, such as the Municipal League and the Township Association. And the response I generally get is that you're asking for a tax rate increase, whether you term it a override or a tax increase. You're affecting the tax rate of the local unit of government. To do that for our elected officials requires expending some amount of political capital. They have to put it out there. They have to know there's going to be pushback. They have to be able to support that with arguments of what services are being lost. So it sort of boils down to how much are you going to gain in revenues, and does that gain in revenues offset the amount of political capital being expended as the effort to gain voter approval for the override. Some local governments have had enough rollback that it matters and they're able to gain voter support. Others have estimated that the gain would not be that much and have not ventured to put it out on the ballot. Before Proposal A, the tax rate rollbacks were greater magnitude than they have been post-Proposal A in 1994. So what we're seeing since 1994 is it's really just the growth in taxable value resulting from turnovers in property that's triggering the rollbacks, and the amount of decline is very small from year to year, but given a number of years it really adds up. So I think that there's going to be a number of local governments considering that option, but the question remains out there: would they gain enough? with the override vote to make a difference, or applying even an increased tax rate to their diminished tax base might not make enough of a difference to matter.
Local governments have done a fantastic job dealing with the revenue cuts you described by getting more efficient. Although it hasn't been easy, doesn't this performance reinforce the validity of Headlee, Prop A, and state revenue sharing legislative actions? And similarly, why shift the political pressure from local governments back to the legislature?
Both fair points. So yes, local governments have done a tremendous job of dealing with the loss of tax base, the loss of state revenue sharing. How much of the residents mattered, I don't know. We don't do public polling to sort of ask the residents their feelings on this. Again, to use an analogy, there's the story of how to cook a frog, that if you attempt to cook a frog and you put it in boiling water, the frog will jump right out and you won't have much luck. But if you put a frog in cold water and turn up the heat over time, eventually you've cooked a frog. Well, that, I think, is what's happening with our local governments and the ability of residents to recognize the diminished level of services around them. If you went from 2000 to 2016 and told the residents these are the services that you're going to be receiving now, and it was a one-time cut, you would probably get a whole lot more pushback from the residents that these are significant and they don't want to do without them. But what we've seen over time is a steady diminishment of the local government services in a way that maybe the residents have not always recognized, and so it's been more acceptable over time. But when you look at the fact that we have several thousand fewer police officers on the streets, when you look at the fact that we have some cities with fire departments that are sort of the minimal level of staffing, and they're coming out to protect the neighboring communities, and they call it saving the basement or some such thing, saving the foundation on which the house is built, it doesn't provide a lot of comfort that you're going to be well served by those communities. So yes, the tax limitations have worked. They've done exactly what they've been intended to do. I don't know when they were put in place that anybody foresaw the sort of loss of taxable value as the state went through the Great Recession. This is a sort of once in a generation. You have to go back to the Great Depression to find anything on that magnitude. And so did they foresee that the property tax values would go down by so much? And if they had foreseen that, would they have provided the opportunity to lessen the decline on a year-to-year basis, or some other mechanism to keep the local governments from going down? Also, as I think about my response, I want to go back to the idea that the Headlee Amendment was meant to create some sort of even balance, is the best way to put it. It was meant to create limitation at the state level, limitation at local government level, mechanisms so that the state wasn't pushing its burden onto local governments, and the ability for both the state and the local governments to deal with circumstances as they changed. But by taking away to have tax rate roll-ups, part of that equalization, part of that evening out has been lost by the state using money coming into the state for school funding as a result of Proposal A to offset reductions in state revenue sharing. It has pitted one type of local government against another, and it hasn't provided the sort of equalizing, the sort of evening out that was envisioned by the Headlee Amendment. So yes, we have limitations on taxes, Yes, Proposal A tax caps have been working, but maybe I would argue against the idea that the Headlee Amendment is working as intended.
Based on the report, would you say that the urban areas that were hardest hit in lost tax base were also the hardest hit by revenue sharing cuts?
I think that is certainly the case. Our statutory state revenue sharing system was some carryover from the prior system that used relative tax effort, but there was some phasing in before the system was abandoned of some 1998 reforms that were meant to equalize the ability of local governments to raise taxes. And so the local governments that have the least relative tax effort, or the least tax base, least fiscal capacity, were mostly our urban areas, and those communities have suffered the most state revenue sharing. When you look at the communities that have suffered the most from loss of tax base, again, those are very much in southeast Michigan, in the Genesee County, the Flint area, Saginaw and Bay and Midland, and even when you look on the west side of the state, compared to their peak values, it is the urban communities that have suffered the most. So I think if we were to put the numbers side by side, you would find great correlation between diminished state revenue sharing and diminished tax base.
You already mentioned that the Research Council doesn't do any polling on public opinion, but do you see current tax policy becoming a hindrance to maintain service levels that are expected from the citizenry? And do you believe the public is becoming concerned that service levels are falling below their expectations? How could tax policy be transformed to meet the needs of local service providers? Is school funding, revenue sharing, and other basic service funding sources at risk in the coming years?
So let me just sort of answer that by starting at the end of that question. The state is not flush with money. It's made promises through the road funding package that was enacted at the end of last year, through a number of other mechanisms to provide services, the personal property tax reform and elsewhere. It has costs coming down through Medicaid, the responsibility for funding Medicaid and other services. The state's not flush with money, and already in the lame duck session we saw some effort to do something about that by shifting the way schools are funded, what percent of the revenues it's getting from income tax, the state income tax. So I do think that local government, whether you're talking about schools or cities, townships, counties, villages, I don't see them rising high on the priority list for our legislators. I think our legislators need to look hard at this and do some evaluating, to take a hard, I don't advocate the status quo is what I'm trying to say here, I guess. In terms of the question of our citizens and their being content or not with the status quo, with the way things are going, I think they might be able to get by now. Local government may or may not play a significant role in their local, in their daily lives. But maybe it's until the next crisis. We saw what happened in Flint, and the water crisis was directly related to the financial well-being of the local government. So where will the next crisis be, and how will that be related to the financial ability of local government to provide services. And I would also say that we probably are not too far removed from the next recession. I have no great insight. I don't have a crystal ball to know when that is. But again, if revenues go down further, if the local governments are not able to recover from their current situation with organic growth or anything like that, then I think it starts to become very real for a lot of people. So I don't have great insights on whether people understand what's going on with their local government and find it acceptable, but I do think it's going to become more and more real as we go forward.
Revenue is necessarily variable at the state level and local level, but local governments have many fixed expenses. Why not also look at the costs of retirement, healthcare, and education expenses as a percentage of local government spending?
I absolutely agree with that. I tried to make the point on one of my ending slides that we have to look at what services are provided, the cost structure of local government, look for opportunities for efficiencies. I don't think the fact that they provided healthy pensions competing with the autos 40 and 50 years ago means that it needs to continue going forward. But that needs to be a discussion that's had, and understanding the revenue constraints of our local governments definitely needs to be part of that discussion. And so we've put this together now, and again, sort of going back to my last slide, let's have the facts before us so we can have that discussion, so we can understand how this is not sustainable going forward and something needs to be done.
Did the study account for the phase-out of the personal property taxes? Alternately, will there be a follow-up study addressing PPT revenue loss?
So 2016 is really the first year that the loss of PPT affected that, and I think that there are a few communities that were very heavy on personal property that maybe appeared worse in our analysis because of the changes in state policy relative to personal property taxation. When trying to deal with all of our local governments, we just found it untenable to try to go in and understand the circumstances of every local government. So in terms of looking at that situation going forward, it's certainly something we're going to monitor. I don't have any real plans to look at the personal property taxation, the changes over time, and the state reimbursement, but if we see there's issues around that, then it will certainly be on our research agenda and something we'll look at over when the time becomes right.
Proposal A only limits growth during times of decreasing value. There's no mechanism to link the descent as Headlee limits the increase. Is this an issue that needs to be addressed? Should this be viewed as an oversight, much the same as the argument of the general fund and school aid fund income tax revenue split as we've heard over the last few weeks?
So to say whether it was an oversight or not, I think would neglect the fact that our Constitution says that our taxable value, our state equalized value, could not be more than 50% of the true cash value of the property. So from 1994 up until the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, 9, wherever it is for the local government and for each parcel of property, there was a growth in the differential between state equalized value and taxable value. With the loss of property, state equalized value for individual parcels came to be the same as taxable value, and as the properties declined in value, those two values were one and the same. If you were to put a cap on the decline of taxable value, you would artificially hold the value of the property above that 50% threshold, and you would create constitutional problems. So yes, I think it is something that was not foreseen when this was put together, but I do not think it is as simple as putting a cap on the rate of decline. I think that would create other issues that would end up being challenged, and you may or may not have as much success dealing with in the long term.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. If you have any questions that were not addressed, we'd be happy to get back with you if you can send us an email. Also, please remember we'll be getting an email from us with feedback on today's webinar. We look forward to any other comments, concerns, questions you may have. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.